Hey, and welcome to themixingprocess.com. Today I want to talk about using reverb on vocals. Now you might be thinking, finally, he's actually making a video about reverb. Since this seems to be the topic that everybody and their cat wants to know about that has anything to do with music, I decided it's probably time to actually sit down and make one about this subject. But you might be wondering why it actually took me so long to get to that point. Well, the truth is, I'm actually a little bit nervous about making this video for two reasons. First of all, people tend to get really distracted with reverb and other effects when they really need to be focusing their efforts and energy on controlling dynamics or frequencies or volume levels, because these things are the foundations of a good mix. We tend to get really distracted with the effects when we haven't nailed down the fundamentals, and that's going to be a really big problem when we get to the end of our mix and wonder why stuff isn't really sounding the way that we want it to. Second, reverb takes time to really get down and implement well. It's really easy to overdo it and not set it up well, and it will mess up and destroy your entire mix. So for those reasons, I've been hesitant to talk about this because I've wanted to focus on some of those other really fundamental things. But at some point, we got to kind of tackle the beast and really get into it and learn how to do it well. So that's what this video is going to be for. And speaking of tools, if you haven't already downloaded my free mixing guide, the 7-step mix, you can download it today on my website, themixingprocess.com. It'll walk you through the basics of mixing, just like we've been talking about, and it'll teach you an organized method of mixing to help get you the results in your sessions that you've really worked hard for. So with that being said, let's dive into a session and we'll learn the different parameters of reverb and how to use them and set them up to get our mixes sounding really, really great. Okay, I'm using the Renaissance Verb plugin from Waves. I love this plugin. I love the visual components that it gives as you're adjusting the different parameters down here. The first parameter we're going to talk about is the reverb type. There's a lot of different types that we can use, and they're usually modeled after rooms or spaces or the method of actually recording that reverb. So we've got halls, rooms, chambers, church, and a couple of plates. Plates are actually created using a physical metal plate that if you move around and position in different ways, it creates different sounds. So we can create a different space to make our mix sound like it's in. So I have a vocal here that I'll show you in just a minute. And if I select a hall, I can make it sound like it's in a big hall, or if I select a room, I can make it kind of sound like it's in a smaller, more intimate space. So the reverb type is important depending on what kind of an environment you're trying to make your mix sound like it is in. The next parameter we're going to talk about is pre-delay. There's a couple different categories that all of these parameters will fit into. The first category is timing. Okay, so the pre-delay, the time, the decay, and early reflections are all parameters that deal with the timing of the reverb. The reason why timing is so critical in reverb is because if it's not timed correctly, it can muddy up the mix really, really quickly. So let's talk about pre-delay and what that is. Pre-delay is if you have the initial signal. Pre-delay is the amount of time that it takes for that reverb to actually kick in. So if I have the pre-delay set to 0, it kind of sounds like this. Holy, holy, holy. Right off the bat, as soon as she's singing those words, you can actually hear the reverb kind of kick in. If I set the pre-delay to be really, really long, let's see what difference that makes. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God. You can kind of hear she says the word and then there's a pause. And then the reverb starts. That's the pre-delay time. And again, we use this to be able to separate the initial signal from the sound of the reverb. This helps preserve the clarity of the signal. So we want to time this with the rhythm and the flow of the vocal so that it fits right in with the vocal and doesn't cloud it up. Speaking of timing, this time parameter dictates basically the length of time that the reverb will last for. So from the very beginning to the very end, how long is it going to be? A short reverb time is going to sound kind of like this.
Holy, holy, holy.
You can hear the reverb, but it dies off really quickly. If we make it longer, it sounds more like this.
Holy, holy, holy.
Okay, so it lasts for a really long time. As we're trying to determine how long we want this decay to last based on what our song sounds like, we're going to adjust this differently. The size parameter kind of goes back to the reverb type that we talked about before. So if I have a hall, if I crank the size all the way up to 100, it's going to sound like this massive hall. If I kind of pull that back, it might sound a little bit smaller. It still has the hall tone and hall sound, but it sounds like a smaller space. So that's kind of what that is for. If I have the size cranked up all the way to 100, it sounds like this.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God.
If I pull it all the way back, it sounds like this.
Holy, holy, holy.
Okay, so it just sounds like it's a little bit smaller of a space. That's what that parameter does. The diffusion, I will be honest with you, I know what it means. I know what it does. Diffusion is actually supposed to refer to the density of your reverb. So the more you kind of crank this up, the thicker and more dense it sounds. The more you pull it back, maybe a little bit thinner or metallic it will sound. I'll be honest though, I play with this parameter and I really don't hear that much of a difference. So I typically kind of leave it as is. I don't worry about it too much. All right, moving on to the early reflections. The early reflections refer to the initial tone of the reverb. So like I talked about at the beginning, the reverb has a specific sound and tone, and that tone changes over the course of the reverb's duration. So at the very beginning, those are called the early reflections. We can adjust the sound of those or the presence of those early reflections. And then as that reverb trails and dies off, that actually is adjusted by this reverb parameter. This adjusts kind of the tail of the reverb. So what we can do is actually blend the early reflections with the tail and kind of blend those two together to get a different sound. So if I want to hear what the early reflections sound like, this is with it all the way off.
Holy, holy, holy.
This is with the early reflections all the way on.
Holy, holy, holy.
So you can kind of hear it added some depth and thickness right at the beginning. That's the first initial tone of the reverb sound. Now what I can do is actually blend this together with the reverb tail to kind of get that initial sound combined with the tail and decay of that reverb. Here's what that sounds like.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.
Or I can pull these early reflections back and have more of the tail be dominant.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.
All right, so those are really, really important tools to adjust the tone of the actual reverb. The other two parameters that we haven't talked about yet are damping and EQ. These kind of are similar, but they have a little bit different effect. EQ should be pretty familiar to you. EQ is used to either cut or boost specific frequencies. So on reverb, typically, I will cut out about 200 hertz of that low end. And the reason I do that is because I want my reverb to focus on the main tone of my signal. I don't want it to amplify a lot of that low end rumble that's down there. That's not really helpful in my mix. And a lot of times I'll cut some of the high end stuff as well because that much brightness doesn't always sound and add a lot to the mix. So I'll kind of cut a lot of the lows and some of the highs out. For the damping, What this does is actually think of it as kind of like absorption of specific frequencies. So instead of cutting it, it kind of like throws a blanket over top of it. Listen to when I turn this this high band up, what it sounds like, and then when I pull it back, it kind of sounds like I just threw a blanket over the high end of it.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is.
Okay, so I didn't cut those high frequencies out like I would if I used an EQ. I actually just kind of dampen them down a little bit. So again, that can shape the tone of the overall sound of your reverb. So those are the basic parameters of a reverb. As you can tell, it's really, really easy to create millions of different sounds and tones and styles, even with just one plugin and one reverb type or room sound. So it's a really great tool to use to create different sounds, different tones that will match whatever song or theme you're kind of trying to follow with your music. If you have any questions by this or still confused by this, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to kind of work through this with you if you're still confused by it. Also, if this video was helpful for you, go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel. That'll help me push this content out to more people, be able to help them with their mixes as well. Again, hopefully this was helpful for you. Go be great at what you do. I will see you on the next one.